Hello everyone and welcome to Raven Fed. I'm Reverend Lisa Talbot, and today I want to share with you another book that I have read on my anti-racism journey. This book is So You Want to Talk About Race by Ijeoma Oluo. I read this with one of my book groups and I loved this book. Some of the books concerning race that I'm reading right now are far more academic in tone, and while they are really, really valuable, they feel a little bit like homework. Whereas this book felt like I was sitting down with a friend who was finally safe enough to share the real experiences of being a Black woman in America. Oluo's voice is so personable and open and friendly and just matter of fact that I was really drawn in to her stories. So much of this book is autobiographical in nature. Oluo uses stories from her own life and the experiences that she's had at school and at work with friends and family. And those real life lived experiences really gave a glimpse into what it's like for her to be a Black woman in America. And interestingly enough, a Black woman in the Pacific Northwest, because she talks a lot about living in Seattle and being Black in Seattle. And so since that is a town that I've been in often, it was really good to hear an experience of someone in the Pacific Northwest who encounters racism in places that I know really well. It really brought it home to me that this is not a regional issue in the United States as much as white people would like to believe that racism is only a problem in certain parts of the country. It's not. It's a problem everywhere. And this book really brought that home to me. There are so many great things about this book that I loved and that infuriated me on her behalf, that made me cry, that made me laugh because she has got an amazing sense of humor. But there's just a few things that I marked in here that I wanted to share. One of them was right at the very beginning, and it's a chapter called What If I Talk About Race Wrong? And I think this was a wonderful chapter for her to have right at the beginning of the book, because I think one of the things that holds so many white folks back from talking about race is the fear of saying the wrong thing. And the fear of saying the wrong thing sometimes prevents people from saying anything at all. And so in this chapter, she addresses those fears. She names them, and then she gives really practical, straightforward advice on what to do. And I don't know, I think one of my biggest takeaways from this chapter is, what if I talk about race wrong? You're gonna talk about race wrong. This is a difficult subject. It is an emotional subject. She says in here, racial oppression should always be an emotional topic to discuss. It should always be anger-inducing. As long as racism exists to ruin the lives of countless people of color, it should be something that upsets us. But it upsets us because it exists, not because we talk about it. So I feel like there was some permission giving there, that race should be something that draws from within us all sorts of emotions, anger and outrage and all of those different emotions that discussions of racism elicit. And it's okay that we feel all those things. I mean, I think that's part of the permission is, yes, it's okay to feel those things, but it's important that we are feeling angry because racism exists, not because someone dared to talk about racism in our presence. And so I think that is part of the white work that needs to be done, is making sure any anger or discomfort that we feel is the discomfort at the system of racism, not the discomfort at the very fact that we're talking about racism. She does give some great practical advice, which I found very, very helpful. Part of it, she just says right off the bat, you're going to mess it up. You're going to, but you can do your research. You can remember what the priorities are in the conversation. If you are self-reflective and can start to feel yourself getting defensive or upset, take a breath and pause and ask yourself why that is. And I think one of the other really important things in here is she says, don't force people of color to have conversations about race. Just because it might be something that you as a white person might be curious about or want to talk about does not mean that you have the right to ask those questions of people or to expect an explanation or an answer or an education. And so I found this a very helpful chapter. She does remind us that, we're going to talk about race wrong, and when we do, it's important to apologize and to do better, but to stay in the conversation. The second part that really hit me deeply, and this brought up a lot of old memories of being a teacher in one of the most diverse high schools in the United States. It was a chapter that asked the question, what is the school to prison pipeline? And she told some heart-wrenching stories in here. Stories about children who were being threatened with punishment far beyond any reasonable measure. She was telling a story about her brother who was basically labeled as a problem child right off the bat and never received the level of education he deserved. And she talked about how the public school system sees Black and brown children as violent, disruptive, unpredictable future criminals. And that both broke my heart and reaffirmed what I experienced as a public school teacher. I witnessed Black students being punished more harshly than white students. I witnessed Black students not having the same opportunities for honors and advanced placement classes as white students. I witnessed Black male students in particular being labeled as violent or disruptive just because they were talking, energetically, I guess. But there was a lack of cultural sensitivity or awareness, even about verbal expression, that would get children into situations of punishment that then took them out of the classroom, that then deprived them of education and put them far behind. And then they were punished even more for being behind in class. And it was just this terrible, vicious cycle. And this chapter brought up a lot of that for me. But I know that it's systemic. I know that it was not just the grade level that I taught. I know it was not just the school I taught at. It was not just the school district I taught at. It was not just the state I taught in. It is a systemic issue with the public school system that punishes Black children, in particular Black boys, far more than students of any other demographic. And so this one was a really difficult chapter because it rang so true, because it confirmed with statistics what I witnessed and experienced myself. But it was also really heartbreaking just to think about the lack of opportunity that so many children experience. One of the things that Oluo says in here that I think speaks to my heart the most is the biggest tragedy is the loss of childhood joy. That kids are not allowed to be kids if they're Black kids, or if they're kids that are of color, if they're brown kids. that they are not afforded the same opportunity to have joyful, carefree childhoods that most white children are. And so this was a difficult chapter because, because nothing's changed, because I quit teaching almost 15 years ago, and it feels like nothing has changed. And so this is one of those institutional problems of racism that we have to address. This is one of the systemic problems where the whole system is stacked a certain way that prevents some children from being successful in the system. And so what's gonna be needed is a change to the entire institution. And that seems daunting, and that is daunting, but daunting does not mean impossible. And if our goal is to strive for all children to be able to experience childhood joy, then that is an excellent reason to change the system. Another chapter that hit me hard was the one called "Why Can't I Touch Your Hair?" I know that unwanted touch is a problem, and particularly a problem with Black women and their hair. That unsolicited touch happens all the time. And yet it still blows my mind, because I cannot imagine somebody having the audacity to come up and touch my body without my permission. And yet Black women and Black women's hair in particular is seen as public property for anybody to pat however they want to. The only parallel I could think of for other women was oftentimes pregnant women get their bellies touched by complete strangers. And I know that my friends who have been pregnant have always been outraged at their bellies being seen as private property and people wanting to come up and rub their tummies. And it's that kind of abuse of bodily autonomy, of disrespect of bodily autonomy that Black women deal with when it comes to their hair and people's fetishization of it. Their desire to treat it as something so strange and exotic and to touch it. It is so offensive for someone to invade personal space in that way. And yet Aluo says, since the first Black Americans were brought over as slaves, our bodies have not been our own. We were objects, property. Our bodies were curiosities and tools to be inspected and exploited. And that unsolicited touch is a continuation of that exploitation. And so it is so important to respect bodily autonomy and to not invade people's space, to respect their bodies as their own. It seems ridiculous to have to say that, doesn't it? I'm trying to find the words to say, like, nobody gets to touch your body without your permission. Because most of us learned that when we were little children, and we know that nobody gets to touch our bodies without our permission. And yet Black women have not been afforded even that common courtesy of not having strangers come up and touch them. And so this chapter was very powerful for me as well. She told several stories in this book about workplace issues. And in this one in particular, she tells a story about an employer and his reaction to her hair. And it was painful to read. I cannot begin to imagine the pain that it felt to have to sit through that conversation with her employer. And so I think that, one of the things to me as an old English teacher is books allow us to glimpse into other people's lives. And while we cannot experience those things for ourselves, we can get a tiny little taste of what somebody else experienced. And it was painful. It was really painful to read this chapter and think about the amount of unwanted touch that some women have to endure, Black women in particular, when it comes to their hair. So, don't touch people's hair. Don't touch people's bodies. Don't touch anything without permission. That's creepy and gross. Don't touch stuff. Don't touch people. I mean, man, why do we have to say that out loud? Don't touch people without their permission. But obviously it still needs to be said because Black women are being disrespected in a variety of ways. But the lack of bodily autonomy is particularly outrageous to me. The last chapter of the book says, talking is great, but what else can I do? And the final chapter gives a lot of practical, everyday actions that everyone can do. Voting local, looking at your school's curriculum, seeing what is being taught, seeing what is available in the library, seeing what's being taught in history and what's not, speaking up, supporting businesses that are owned by people of color, giving money to organizations that fight racism and oppression, support art in all of its forms that are made by people of color, discuss police reform with your mayor and city council, vote for diverse government representatives. There's so many excellent, practical, on-the-ground actions that anyone can take in order to do this work of anti-racism in our own communities. She ends the book with this sentence: racial oppression starts in our homes, our offices, our cities, and our states, and it can end there as well. So start talking, not just problems, but solutions. We can do this together. I love that she ended on a note of hope. It's hard to see that hope sometimes. It's hard to feel that hope living through this time period that we're in, experiencing what we're experiencing right now with protests all over the country, with more police shootings, with all of this in the midst of a pandemic that disproportionately affects people of color. I appreciate that she has hope and that her hope can help give me hope. And it starts with us. It starts with us individually. It starts with conversations in our homes, with our friends and our loved ones. It starts in the workplace as we advocate for equality and diversity and inclusion in the workplace. It starts in our local government. It starts in our own schools. It's easy to get overwhelmed by the scope of systemic racism. But if we can focus down to those things we can control, our own understanding, our own continuing education, our own relationships, our own neighborhoods and cities and states, all of that work makes a difference. I love this book. I will read it again. I devoured it the first time through. I was actually really glad I was reading it with a book group because it made me slow down and take it in chunks instead of just reading cover to cover. I follow Ijoma Aluo on Instagram as well, and she has an awesome Instagram. She does a lot of Instagram stories and videos and stuff. She has great posts. She has a new book that's coming out this fall. I really recommend this one. It is personable. It is autobiographical. I think that she explains concepts in ways that are great for beginners to the fight. This to me is a great entry level book for white people who want to understand some basic concepts and issues when it comes to race and racism and the work to be anti-racist. So I think that this is a great one. Like I said, I love her tone. She's so personable. She does cuss in this book, but frankly, if you are more concerned about cussing than you are about racism, you're probably not going to be watching my videos to begin with or reading these books. But I just really love her voice because it felt so very real, and being able to watch her in videos on Instagram and hear her voice in my head as I read her book, it really was a great experience. Like Aluo does, let's end on a note of hope and say that we can all continue to listen and learn, and education is such an important part of this process. But let us also move towards action. Let us look at our own lives. Let us look into our own relationships, the organizations that we are a part of, and whoever we are, wherever we are, let's work to be anti-racist together.